Imagine a world with no funerals, no coffins, no goodbyes, just a body left where it fell, and nobody quite sure what to do next. Because somewhere around 300,000 years ago, that was the reality for the first humans who ever lost someone they loved. And figuring out how to handle death would end up shaping human civilization in ways nobody could have predicted. So let's go back to the very beginning and trace exactly what ancient humans did after someone died. Let's start with a surprising fact. Our species was not the first to bury its dead on purpose. At a cave called Cima de los Huesos in Spain, scientists found the bones of at least 28 individuals who lived over 400,000 years ago, deliberately placed at the bottom of a 50-foot vertical shaft. Archaeologists still argue about whether this counts as a true burial or just a convenient way to dispose of bodies. But the presence of a single pink quartz hand axe among the bones, an object that served no practical purpose there, suggests something more than simple disposal was happening. Something almost ceremonial. That mystery only deepens when we look at the Neanderthals, our closest evolutionary cousins. At sites like Shanidar Cave in Iraq, they appear to have buried their dead in shallow pits, sometimes in a curled fetal position. For decades, popular science claimed these burials included flowers based on pollen found in the soil, a detail so poetic it became legend. Though more recent research suggests the pollen may have been introduced by burrowing rodents, rather than mourning Neanderthals, which just goes to show how much of what we think we know about ancient death rituals is still being revised as new evidence comes in. But what is not in dispute is that by the time we get to modern Homo sapiens in the Upper Paleolithic period, roughly 30,000 years ago, burial practices become undeniably intentional and increasingly elaborate. And nowhere is that clearer than at a site in Russia called Sungir, where archaeologists uncovered the graves of two children, buried head to head, covered in thousands of tiny ivory beads that would have taken an estimated 10,000 hours of labor to carve, along with spears made from straightened mammoth tusks. A staggering investment of time and resources for people who lived hand to mouth as hunter-gatherers, which tells us that even 60,000 years before agriculture, human communities were willing to pour enormous effort into honoring their dead. And one material shows up again and again across these ancient graves, all over the world, from Europe to Australia to the Americas. That material is red ochre, a natural iron oxide pigment that ancient people used to coat bodies, tools, and grave walls. While we can never know for certain what it symbolized, many researchers believe the blood-red color was meant to represent life, vitality, or perhaps a symbolic rebirth into whatever came next. And this use of ochre appears so consistently across cultures with no contact with each other that it suggests something deep in the human mind was reaching for the same idea, independently. That death needed to be marked, with color, with meaning, with intention. As human societies transitioned from nomadic hunting and gathering into settled farming communities around 10,000 years ago, the way people handled death transformed right along with it. And one of the strangest, most fascinating examples comes from Çatalhöyük, a massive Neolithic settlement in modern-day Turkey, where the dead were not buried in separate cemeteries at all, but directly beneath the floors of the very houses where the living continued to eat, sleep, and raise their children. Meaning, ancient families in this city were literally walking on top of their ancestors every single day. And even stranger, some skulls were later dug back up, plastered with clay to reconstruct facial features, painted and kept in the home, or passed around the community. A practice archaeologists call the skull cult, which suggests the dead were not seen as gone, but as continuing members of the household, present in a physical and spiritual sense long after their bodies had stopped functioning. This idea of keeping the dead close rather than pushing them away shows up again in the Chinchorro culture of the Atacama Desert, along the coast of modern Chile and Peru, a group of fishing people who began mummifying their dead an astonishing 2,000 years before the Egyptians ever did. And remarkably, the Chinchorro mummified everyone, not just elites or rulers, but men, women, children, and even miscarried fetuses. Removing internal organs, reinforcing the body with sticks and reeds, covering it in a paste made from ash, and finally painting the skin with black manganese, or later, red ochre, creating lifelike mummies that families would keep above ground for years, sometimes repainting or repairing them as needed, treating their deceased loved ones almost like living participants in daily life, rather than distant memories to be sealed away. And speaking of mummification, we obviously cannot talk about ancient death practices without landing in Egypt, where death was viewed not as an ending, but as a doorway into an eternal afterlife. And the process of preparing a body for that journey was extraordinarily involved. It began began with priests removing the internal organs, since decomposition needed to be stopped for the soul to have a body to return to. The brain, in particular, was considered useless, so embalmers would pull it out, piece by piece, through the nostrils using a hooked tool and simply discard it, while the heart was carefully preserved, because ancient Egyptians believed it held a person's memory, personality, and moral worth. It would be weighed against the feather of the goddess Mot in the afterlife, to determine whether the soul deserved paradise. After the body was dried out using a natural salt called natron, for about 40 days it would be wrapped in hundreds of yards of linen bandages, often with protective amulets tucked between the layers, before being sealed inside one or more coffins, and placed in a tomb stocked with food, furniture, jewelry, and sometimes even servant figurines called shabtis, meant to work on the deceased's behalf in the next world. While Egypt gets most of the spotlight, ancient China developed its own deeply structured approach to death, especially for royalty, most famously demonstrated by the first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, who ordered the construction of an entire underground army of over 8,000 life-sized terracotta soldiers, complete with horses and chariots, to protect him in the afterlife. A project so massive, it reportedly took nearly 40 years and hundreds of thousands of workers to complete, and this reflects a broader belief across many ancient cultures, that the afterlife was not some abstract spiritual concept, but a literal continuation of earthly existence, meaning the dead would need food, weapons, transportation, and servants, just as they had in life, which is exactly why grave goods show up so consistently across ancient burial sites worldwide, from Viking ship burials in Scandinavia, where a person of high status might be laid to rest inside an actual wooden ship, along with weapons, tools, and sometimes even animals, to elaborate burial mounds in ancient Britain, and to the indigenous cultures of North America, who built massive earthen structures like Cahokia's Monk's Mound. This pattern makes it clear ancient people across the entire planet, with no communication between them, independently arrived at the same basic conclusion: that death was not truly the end, and that the living had a responsibility to prepare the dead for whatever came next. While methods differed wildly, from burial to mummification to cremation, which appears in ancient India, Greece, and Rome, where burning a body was believed to release the soul quickly and cleanly from its physical shell, the underlying emotional core was often strikingly similar. Grief needed an outlet, memory needed a physical anchor, and the living needed a way to feel connected to those they had lost. And honestly, when you strip away the pyramids, the terracotta armies, and the ivory-beaded burial suits, what you are left with is something remarkably human and remarkably familiar, because ancient people were not so different from us. They wanted their dead to be remembered, honored, and cared for. And in a strange way, modern funerals, headstones, flowers left at gravesides, and even the photographs we keep of loved ones who have passed are direct descendants of that same ancient impulse. First appeared hundreds of thousands of years ago in a cave in Spain, which means the next time you visit a cemetery or light a candle for someone you lost, you are participating in one of the oldest continuous traditions in human history, a thread connecting you directly back to the very first humans who looked at a body and refused to simply walk away.